The room in the basement. When Lydia inherited her grandmother's old Victorian house, she thought it was a dream come true. The sprawling estate sat at the edge of a quiet town, surrounded by lush woods and a garden that, though overgrown, had the potential to be beautiful again. But there was one part of the house that unnerved her: the basement. Her grandmother had always forbidden her from going down there. As a child, Lydia had obeyed, but now, as the new owner of the house, she felt compelled to explore every corner of it. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. Lydia spent her days cleaning and organizing, uncovering dusty heirlooms and forgotten trinkets. The house felt alive with history, its creaks and groans comforting in their familiarity. One rainy afternoon, curiosity got the better of her. Armed with a flashlight, she descended the creaky wooden stairs into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint scent of mildew filled her nostrils. The basement was larger than she expected, filled with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs. But what caught her attention was a door at the far end of the room. It was made of dark wood, its surface scratched and weathered. A heavy iron lock hung from the handle. Lydia frowned. She didn't remember seeing a key for this door in her grandmother's belongings. Her heart raced as she tugged at the lock. It didn't budge. Frustrated, she turned to leave, but something stopped her. A faint sound, like a whisper, coming from behind the door. She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the empty basement. The whispering stopped. Shaking her head, Lydia told herself it was just her imagination. She hurried back upstairs, locking the basement door behind her. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of the whispering played over and over in her mind. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, but a nagging curiosity gnawed at her. The next day, she searched the house for the key to the basement door. After hours of rummaging through drawers and boxes, she found it. A small rusted key tucked inside an old jewelry box. With trembling hands, she returned to the basement. The door loomed before her, its scratched surface almost seeming to pulse. She slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open. The room beyond was small and dark, its walls lined with strange symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, and on it lay an old book bound in black leather. The air was thick, and the faint scent of sulfur stung her nose. Lydia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but curiosity won out. She stepped into the room and picked up the book. The leather felt warm to the touch, almost alive. The symbols on the cover were indecipherable, but as she opened the book, the whispering began again, louder this time. The pages were filled with strange text that seemed to shift and writhe as she tried to read it. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural voice. "You shouldn't have come." The room grew colder, and the symbols on the walls began to glow a sickly green. Lydia dropped the book, her heart racing. The door behind her slammed shut, and the voice laughed, a deep, menacing sound that echoed in her bones. "Who's there?" she shouted, spinning around. The shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. "You woke me," it said, its voice like grinding stone, "and now you'll pay the price." Lydia backed away, but the figure moved closer, its skeletal fingers reaching for her. Desperate, she grabbed the book and hurled it at the creature. The moment the book touched the ground, the symbols on the walls flared brightly, and the creature let out a deafening scream. The room shook violently, and Lydia felt herself being pulled toward the door by an unseen force. She stumbled out of the room just as the door slammed shut behind her. The whispers stopped, and the basement fell silent. Breathing heavily, Lydia locked the door and ran upstairs. She threw the key into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. For weeks, she avoided the basement, but strange things began to happen around the house. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and she often felt as if she were being watched. At night, she would hear faint whispers coming from the floorboards. One evening, as she sat in the living room, she heard a knock at the basement door. Her blood ran cold. "Lydia," a voice called softly, the same guttural tone she'd heard in the room. "You can't keep me locked away forever." The Whispering Woods. It started as a simple camping trip. 4 friends, Emma, Ryan, Chloe, and Jake, had been planning the weekend getaway for weeks. The Whispering Woods were known for their serene beauty, but also for the eerie legends that surrounded them. Locals warned travelers to avoid the woods after dark, claiming the trees whispered secrets that could drive a person mad. The group laughed off the stories as superstition. They were there for adventure, not ghost tales. The first day was uneventful. They set up their tents near a clearing, roasted marshmallows, and told jokes around the campfire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a cool breeze rustled the leaves, creating a soft, melodic hum. "Do you hear that?" Emma asked, tilting her head. "It's just the wind," Ryan said dismissively. But as the night deepened, the hum grew louder, almost like voices whispering just out of earshot. Chloe shivered and moved closer to the fire. "It's creepy. Let's just ignore it and go to sleep." Reluctantly, they agreed. Around midnight, Emma woke up to faint murmurs. She sat up, her heart pounding. Outside the tent, the whispers were clearer now, like dozens of voices speaking in hushed tones. She unzipped the tent and peeked out. The woods were bathed in pale moonlight, and the trees seemed to sway in rhythm with the whispers. Her breath hitched as she saw a shadow dart between the trees. "Ryan, Jake," she called softly, hoping one of them had wandered off. There was no response. The next morning, Emma told the group what she'd heard and seen. Ryan rolled his eyes. "You probably imagined it. These woods are getting to you." Chloe, however, looked uneasy. "I heard something too. It wasn't just the wind." Jake shrugged. "Let's stick together today, okay? No wandering off." They spent the day hiking, but an uneasy tension hung over them. The forest seemed darker, the air heavier. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, the whispers returned. This time they were louder and more distinct. Words like "leave" and "stay" floated on the air, overlapping in a chilling chorus. Jake grabbed a flashlight and stormed out of his tent. "Enough of this. Who's out there?" The others followed, clutching their own lights. The beams cut through the darkness, but they revealed nothing except the dense trees. "Maybe it's just animals," Chloe said, though her voice trembled. But then, a deep, guttural voice echoed through the clearing. "You shouldn't have come." The group froze. The voice didn't sound human. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Panic set in. They huddled together, their flashlights darting around the trees. Then, one by one, the lights began to flicker and die. "Run!" Ryan shouted, grabbing Chloe's hand. They sprinted through the woods, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at their clothes and skin. Emma tripped over a root and fell hard. When she looked up, she saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes and a twisted smile. "Help me!" Emma screamed, but the others were too far ahead to hear. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally jerky. Emma scrambled backward, her heart racing. Suddenly, Ryan appeared, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "Come on!" he yelled, dragging her along. They caught up with Chloe and Jake at the edge of the clearing. The group collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Jake demanded. "I don't know," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "But we need to get out of here." The group decided to leave immediately, even though it was the middle of the night. They packed up their gear in record time and started hiking back toward the trailhead. But the whispers followed them. No matter how fast they walked, the voices seemed to stay just behind them. Occasionally, they would catch glimpses of the figure in the trees, watching them with its glowing eyes. As dawn broke, the whispers began to fade. The group finally reached their car and piled in, desperate to leave the woods behind. But as they drove away, Emma glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, she saw the figure standing at the edge of the trees, its twisted smile still visible. "You'll never leave," the whispers echoed in her mind. Even now, weeks later, Emma can still hear them sometimes, faint and distant, as if the woods are calling her back.
The Midnight Watcher. It was a quiet, moonless night in a small village nestled between dense, dark woods. Layla, a college student, was staying at her grandmother's old house for the weekend. The house was charming during the day, but eerie at night, with creaking floorboards and shadows that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. Layla had always been skeptical of her grandmother's stories about the Watcher. A figure said to roam the woods at night, peering into windows to find someone alone. Her grandmother would warn, "Never leave your curtains open after dark, or you might invite him in." That night, Layla laughed at the thought as she got ready for bed. She left the curtains slightly open, letting the faint glow of the streetlight outside seep into the room. What harm could it do, she thought, brushing off her grandmother's warnings. At around midnight, Layla woke with a start. She wasn't sure why. The room was silent except for the faint rustling of leaves outside. She turned over, trying to fall back asleep, but a strange sensation prickled at her skin, like she was being watched. She sat up and glanced toward the window. For a moment, she saw nothing unusual. Then, she noticed it. A faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the tree line, unmoving. Her heart began to race. "It's just my imagination," she whispered to herself. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized the figure was real, and it was staring directly at her. Layla froze, her breath hitching. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. She reached for her phone, trying to shine its flashlight toward the window, but her hands trembled too much to hold it steady. When the beam finally illuminated the spot where the figure stood, there was nothing there, just trees swaying gently in the wind. Relieved, she laughed nervously. "I'm losing it," she muttered, pulling the curtain shut tightly. She crawled back into bed, her heart still pounding. But just as she was about to drift off, a soft tapping sound echoed through the room. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. Layla's stomach twisted into knots. She didn't want to look, but couldn't resist. Slowly, she peeled back the curtain just an inch. Her blood ran cold. The figure was back, closer this time, its face obscured by shadows. But there was something unnatural about the way it stood. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an odd angle, as if it was studying her. She slammed the curtain shut and backed away from the window, her mind racing. Should she call the police? run to her grandmother's room? Before she could decide, the tapping grew louder and more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't just coming from the window anymore. It was coming from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. Layla grabbed her phone and bolted for the door. But as she reached for the handle, the tapping stopped. Silence. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. That's when she heard it. A low, raspy voice whispering her name. Layla? Her blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the room. She spun around, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. The whisper came again, closer this time. Layla. In a panic, she flung the door open and ran down the hall to her grandmother's room. She pounded on the door until it creaked open. "Grandma, wake up!" she cried. But the room was empty. The bed was neatly made and there was no sign of her grandmother. Layla's phone buzzed in her hand and she glanced down to see a message. "Why did you open the curtains?" Her breath caught in her throat. The message wasn't from her contacts. It was from an unknown number. Before she could react, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. She felt a presence behind her, cold and suffocating. Slowly, she turned around. There, standing in the hallway, was the figure. Its face was now visible, a hollow void where eyes should have been, and a mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. It raised a long, bony finger to its lips and whispered, "Shh." The next morning, the villagers found Layla's room empty, her bed untouched. The only sign of her was the phone lying on the floor, its screen cracked. On it was a single message: "He's watching." And from that day on, the villagers made sure to always close their curtains before nightfall.